All right, so for the intermediate level, we are going to, again, look for key features given the graph, but we're going to add a couple pieces. We're going to add the increasing and decreasing intervals, and we're going to add the positive and negative intervals. So the domain range, intercepts, vertex, and end behavior, that is all the basic things that we already know how to do. We're just adding the increase, decrease, positive, negative. So again, as we're looking at our picture or our graph, I just want to show you or have you look at those things that you know are important. I know this point is important. I know this point is important. This is the point 30. This is the point -10. We also know that this little guy here, our y-intercept, is important, and that's the point 0.3. And we also have that vertex point up here, this highest point right there. And that vertex point looks like it's 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1, 4. All right, so we have our vertex, which is that point where our graph changes direction. So notice that it goes up, hits that point, and then starts going back down. So the vertex is a key point because it helps us see where direction changes. We have our intercepts, which helps us see when our graph is above. So it's above the line between our x-intercepts in this case, and it's below the line or below those x-intercepts. So from negative infinity up to that point, it's below, and from negative or positive 3 to infinity, it's below. So those are some key things that we want to look at. We also need to pay attention to our end behavior. So again, as we look at our left endpoint, so this is our left endpoint, notice that is going down to negative infinity. As we're looking at our right endpoint, again, it's going down to negative infinity. We talked about this on the last video, how with a quadratic, your endpoints are usually doing the same thing. I shouldn't say usually. They're always doing the same thing. So we want to keep track of that. So if I'm graphing something and I don't have the graph ahead of time, we should know that if it's a quadratic, my endpoint should be going the same way. All right, so from there, we've got our key points just by looking at our graph. And now we're going to just answer our questions based off of that graph. And so as we're looking, domain, remember we talked about domain is always negative infinity to infinity. I'm always going to have an x value. If I take this x value down here and I come down, eventually, as this continues down, it's eventually going to cross somewhere down here. Okay, every single time I'm going to have some type of point. Whether I'm going up or down, I'm going to hit a value that's on that graph. All right, and so that's why our domain is negative infinity to infinity, because you always have a value. So negative infinity to infinity. When we look at our range, at least for this one, notice that because we talked about how this point is going on forever, my value down here, like I'm going to always have a point, okay, down here. What happens though is that my values for my y's end. So before we said it, like on the example for basic, remember that it was facing the other way. And so it started at a point and went up to infinity. Now, because it's going down forever, then it goes from negative infinity and then it's going to come up and it stops at your vertex point. So like I always have a y value until I hit my y value of my vertex, which is 4. And so then I have my bracket because 4 is a point on the graph. So remember, parentheses means it's not included. A bracket means it is included. And when I'm looking at range, we will have a bracket. When I'm looking at intervals where I have positive, negative, or I have infinity, it's always parentheses because infinity is not a number. It's a concept. So intercepts, we already have labeled because we did that up on our graph. So we have our x-intercepts, and our x-intercepts were at -1, 0, and at 3, 0. And then we also had our y-intercept. And our y-intercept was at the point 0, 3. All right, and so those are those key points that I said we should always be able to recognize that when we're given a graph. Our vertex point, we already have listed as 1, 4. That's that point where it changes direction. And now we look at increasing, decreasing, and positive, negative. All right, so increasing and decreasing has to do with, or we're looking at the value of your vertex. Okay, so these two are dependent on the vertex, where positive and negative is dependent on your intercepts, your x-intercepts. All right, so as we're looking at increasing and decreasing, basically you just take your pen or pencil and you're putting it on the left endpoint. Okay, so if I put it on the left endpoint and I look to see what's going on, notice that it's going up, okay, until I get to that vertex point. So again, it's going up, it's increasing, okay, as we're looking, going up until we get to that point. So that means it's increasing, and we're talking about our x-intercept or our x values. So it's increasing from negative infinity until we get to the x value of your vertex, which is 1. So that means it's increasing from negative infinity to 1. And again, we just have parentheses when we're talking about increasing and decreasing. And then it's decreasing, so it's going down. So it hits that vertex point, that hits that 4. And then from that point on, my values are going down. Okay, and so that means that it's decreasing. Again, we only care about our x values. It's decreasing from x being 1 to infinity. So decreasing from 1 to infinity. And notice again, like our value, our x value of our vertex is how we get that increasing and decreasing value. All right, so now when we look at positive and negative, we care about when it is above and below the x-axis. So as we're looking at my graph for where it's positive, positive means it's above the x-axis. So that means it's this area right here. So these are the values of x where my graph is above the x-axis. So that means it's between -1 and 3, it's above in this graph. So -1 to 3. That means it's below, okay, so it's below the graph over here. So negative infinity, it's below because it would be down here somewhere. And so let's see, how can I? So like here. So this would be below. It's below the line and below the line. And so that means it's from negative infinity. So it's negative from negative infinity to -1. And then it's also negative from 3 to infinity. So let's go back and look at that graph and that value one more time. So notice how we have our x-intercepts at -1 and 3. And so when I look at my graph, here's my -1 value. And look it to the left of it. So from negative infinity to that value of -1, my graph is below. Like this area below. So then if I look at my next value or my next x-intercept, which is at 3, so from 3 to infinity, if I'm looking at I'm looking at my x-axis. Okay, so from 3 to infinity, again, my graph, the blue part, is below the x-axis. So if it was faced the other way, notice how that changes things. So if I was looking, I know it's not asking you this, but if I was looking at this graph, I still need those key pieces. I need this value and this value. If I'm looking at when it's positive from negative infinity up to, what was that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to -5. It's above, it's below from -5 to -1, and then it's above again from 1 to infinity. And so as you're looking at your graphs, make sure you kind of break that down. Those intercepts are key pieces. That's why we call them key features. Key features of a graph that help us know. And now as we look at our last little bit with our end behavior, we're saying, okay, when x is negative infinity, this is, again, my left-hand side. If I look at my left end point, up here, my left end point, it's going down. If I look at my right end point, it's still going down. Like they are going down forever. And so both my endpoints, when I'm looking at end behavior, they both are going to negative infinity.